It was a crisp autumn morning, and the lobby of Crestwood National Bank buzzed with activity. Employees in sharp suits moved efficiently behind polished counters, while customers, some impatient and others simply passing the time, waited in line. Among them stood Christopher, an elderly black man with a weathered face and a kind smile. His neatly pressed suit was understated but dignified, and he carried a well-worn briefcase that hinted at years of faithful service. Walking with measured steps, his cane tapped softly against the gleaming marble floor. As Christopher approached the counter, a subtle tension filled the air. Susan and Mark, both bank employees in their mid-30s, exchanged a glance. Their professional facades slipped momentarily, and a faint frown crossed Susan's face. "Can I help you?" Susan asked, her tone clipped as Christopher stepped forward. "Yes, young lady," Christopher replied with a courteous smile. "I'd like some assistance with my account." Nearby, Mark leaned closer to Susan and murmured under his breath, his words barely audible to the customers. "Another one of those time-wasters," he muttered. Susan sighed audibly, her impatience thinly veiled as her eyes swept over Christopher. "Do you even have an account here?" she asked, her voice dripping with condescension. Christopher, unruffled, maintained his calm demeanor, his gentle smile unwavering. "Unwavering, yes, ma'am, I do," Christopher replied calmly. "I've been a customer here for over 20 years. Susan raised an eyebrow, her skepticism evident. "Well, we'll need to see some ID," she said curtly. Christopher reached into his pocket, withdrew his wallet, and handed over his identification with steady hands. Susan took it, squinting at the details as her dubious expression lingered. "You sure this is your account?" Mark interjected, stepping closer with a smug air. "We've had some incidents before." Christopher raised an eyebrow, though his voice remained composed. "I'm certain, young man. I've been banking here since before you started working." The subtle jab stung, and Mark scoffed, muttering, "Some people think they can just walk in here and waste our time." Emboldened by Mark's attitude, Susan shoved the ID back across the counter. "Look, sir, we're very busy today. Maybe you should come back when you're more prepared." Christopher's expression stayed composed, though a flicker of disappointment crossed his eyes. "I am prepared," he said softly. "I'd appreciate it if you could check my account." Instead of responding, Susan motioned to a nearby security guard, a burly man with a stern face. The guard approached, his imposing presence adding an unnecessary layer of intimidation. "Is there a problem here?" the guard asked, his tone firm. "No problem," Christopher replied evenly. "I'm just trying to access my account." Susan leaned over and whispered something to the guard, who nodded curtly. "Sir, I think it's best if you leave for today," the guard said, gesturing toward the door. Christopher stood still for a moment, his grip tightening slightly on his cane. The room grew quieter as other customers began to take notice of the unfolding scene. Without raising his voice, Christopher asked, "Are you asking me to leave without resolving my business here?" "Yes," Susan said bluntly. "You're holding up the line." Christopher held her gaze for a long moment, his expression steady but unreadable. Then, with a slight nod, Christopher turned and began to walk toward the exit, his cane tapping softly against the marble floor once again. The door closed behind him with a faint click, leaving the employees to resume their work, oblivious to the storm quietly brewing beneath the surface. Later that day, Christopher re-entered the bank, his pace slow and deliberate. His hands rested in the pockets of a neatly pressed overcoat, his posture slightly stooped with age. Despite this, his eyes carried a glint of wisdom and experience that seemed to defy the years. It was late afternoon, and the bank was bustling with activity. Customers stood in orderly lines, while bankers in sharp suits darted from one desk to another, juggling phone calls and client meetings. Christopher approached the reception desk patiently. Seated there was a young man, barely in his 20s, idly scrolling through his phone. His name tag read Ethan. Without looking up, Ethan waved dismissively. "Yes, what do you need?" he asked, his tone indifferent. Christopher offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon. I was wondering if I could speak to someone about opening a corporate account. I have some business matters to discuss." Ethan finally lifted his gaze, his expression shifting instantly. He scanned Christopher's appearance, the slightly worn coat, the old-fashioned hat, the absence of a briefcase or luxury watch. His lips curled into a smirk. A corporate account? You sure you're in the right place, sir? Ethan asked, his words laced with sarcasm. Christopher, unshaken, replied calmly, Yes, I'm sure. I'd like to speak to a manager, if possible. Before Ethan could respond, another employee, a woman named Sophia, walked by and overheard the exchange. She glanced at Christopher, her brows furrowing slightly, before leaning down to whisper to Ethan. Does he look like someone who could even afford a corporate account? She murmured. Probably just wasting our time. Christopher caught the remark, but chose to remain composed. This time, he addressed them both. I'd appreciate it if someone could assist me, he said evenly. I have all the necessary documents with me. Ethan exchanged a glance with Sophia, rolling his eyes theatrically. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, his tone sharp and dismissive. Look, sir, this is a high-end financial institution. We don't have time for, well, whatever it is you're trying to do here. The harshness in Ethan's words drew the attention of nearby customers and staff. Some whispered among themselves, their faces reflecting unease, while others looked visibly uncomfortable but remained silent. Sophia decided to escalate the situation, stepping forward with a firm but condescending tone. Sir, we have policies in place. Without an appointment and proper credentials, we can't entertain requests like yours. And frankly, this branch caters to clients of a certain caliber. The implication was clear, and though the words stung, Christopher's composure remained intact. I understand policies and respect them, he said evenly. However, I believe if you take a moment to review my paperwork, you'll see that I meet the requirements. Sophia let out a short, derisive laugh. Paperwork? You're kidding, right? Sir, I think it's best if you take your business elsewhere. We're quite busy here. By now, a small crowd had gathered. Some customers stared in disbelief at the way Christopher was being treated, while others averted their gaze, unwilling to intervene. A middle-aged woman whispered to her companion, Why are they treating him like that? He hasn't done anything wrong. Ethan, sensing the growing tension, decided to end the interaction abruptly. All right, that's enough, he said loudly, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. You're disrupting the workflow here. Christopher hesitated, his gaze sweeping across the onlookers. His calm demeanor never wavered, though a flicker of disappointment passed through his eyes. Slowly, Christopher reached into his coat pocket and carefully pulled out a neatly folded document. Perhaps if you look at this, it might clear up any misunderstandings, he said, his voice calm and steady. Ethan barely glanced at the paper before pushing it back toward Christopher dismissively. I said leave. We don't have time for this. Sophia nodded in agreement, stepping closer to Christopher as if to physically usher him out. You heard him. This isn't the place for you, she said sharply. At that moment, a third employee, a junior banker named Mia, hesitantly stepped forward. She had been observing the interaction from her desk, a knot of discomfort tightening in her chest. Maybe we should just take a look at his documents, Mia suggested softly, addressing both Ethan and Sophia. It won't hurt to check. Ethan shot her an irritated glare. Mia, stay out of this. We know what we're doing. But Mia persisted, her voice firmer this time. He's not causing any trouble. He's just asking for assistance. Isn't that our job? Sophia turned to Mia, her tone icy and condescending. Mia, if you want to waste your time, go ahead. But don't expect us to entertain every random walk-in who thinks they can open a corporate account. The tension in the room was palpable, and the air seemed heavy with unspoken judgment. Christopher, sensing the hostility and unwillingness to help, took a step back. It's all right, he said quietly, his tone unwavering but tinged with sadness. I didn't mean to cause a scene. I'll take my business elsewhere. He turned to leave, his steps slow but dignified. As he reached the door, he paused for a moment and glanced back at the staff who had dismissed him so quickly. There was no anger in his eyes, only a quiet sadness that spoke volumes. Without another word, Christopher walked out into the cold, the door closing softly behind him. Trembled as she recounted the experience, her pain palpable in every word. It wasn't just about the loan, Danielle said, her eyes glistening with tears. It was about being told without words that I didn't belong, that no matter how hard I worked, my worth would always be questioned. Amanda sat silently, her usual confidence shaken. For the first time, she began to understand the depth of the systemic issues she had previously dismissed. Patrick, who had largely remained indifferent, found himself deeply moved by Danielle's story. Her words echoed in his mind long after the session ended. The therapy sessions continued, each week peeling back another layer of misunderstanding and prejudice. Christopher occasionally attended as an observer, his calm presence reminding everyone of the purpose behind their journey. "I want you to understand something," Christopher said during a group discussion. "This isn't about pointing fingers or assigning blame. It's about recognizing the humanity in each other, about building bridges where walls once stood." Gradually, Amanda and Patrick began to change. Amanda, once quick to dismiss her biases, started to catch herself in moments of unconscious judgment. Patrick, who had often scoffed at the idea of privilege, began listening more and speaking less, allowing himself to learn from others' experiences. Months later, the two approached Christopher with a newfound humility. "We were wrong," Amanda admitted, her voice tinged with regret. "Not just in how we treated you, but in how we've approached so many things in our lives." Patrick nodded in agreement. "We can't undo what we did, but we want to do better, starting now." Christopher smiled, his expression warm but resolute. "Growth begins when we choose to see beyond ourselves," he replied. "Now, use what you've learned to make this place, and this world, a little better for everyone." From that day forward, Amanda and Patrick became vocal advocates for change within the bank. They worked to implement new training programs, fostered an inclusive environment, and ensured no customer would face the kind of treatment Christopher endured. The transformation wasn't perfect, and there were still challenges, but the bank began to shift, one step at a time. And through it all, Christopher remained a quiet but powerful reminder that dignity, patience, and understanding could spark change, even in the most resistant hearts. Trembled as she recounted how the denial had shattered her dream of owning her first home. "It wasn't just about the loan," Danielle said, her voice heavy with emotion. "It was about being told, without words, that I wasn't good enough, that no matter how hard I worked, someone would always see me as less." Amanda found herself wiping away tears. For the first time, she truly understood how the systems she had unconsciously upheld could devastate lives. She thought back to the way she had treated Christopher. Though she hadn't said anything explicitly racist, her actions had spoken louder than words. She had dismissed him as unworthy of her respect, basing her judgment solely on his appearance. Patrick's journey was equally transformative, though it began with resistance. His defensiveness made the first few sessions challenging. He was quick to justify his actions, pointing out moments when he believed he had treated everyone fairly. But as the weeks went on, the weight of the stories he heard began to chip away at his excuses. One day, during a role reversal exercise, Patrick was paired with a black man named Harold. Harold took on the role of a banker, while Patrick acted as the customer. Harold treated Patrick with cold indifference, layering his responses with thinly veiled condescension. Each dismissive glance and cutting remark hit Patrick like a punch to the gut. "That's what it feels like," Harold said afterward, his voice calm but edged with sadness. "That's what so many of us go through every day, feeling like we're less than, just because of the color of our skin." Patrick couldn't respond. For the first time, he felt the sting of prejudice, even in a simulated environment. The experience left him shaken, a wake-up call he could no longer ignore. Over the next several weeks, both Amanda and Patrick began to change, not just in how they viewed the world, but in how they saw themselves. Amanda became more introspective, questioning her assumptions and working to replace judgment with empathy. Patrick, humbled by his experience, started to listen more and defend less. They didn't just acknowledge their biases, they actively sought to dismantle them. Slowly but surely, their actions began to reflect a newfound understanding, one built on respect and a commitment to treat every person with dignity. They started by acknowledging their privilege, blind spots, and the harm they had caused, both intentionally and unintentionally. The therapy sessions had been challenging, often pushing them far outside their comfort zones, but the results were deeply transformative. Christopher, though not directly involved in the sessions, followed their progress closely. He received weekly reports from the facilitators and even attended a few group sessions as a silent observer. Watching Amanda and Patrick confront their vulnerabilities and show a genuine willingness to change filled him with cautious hope. When the program concluded, Amanda and Patrick requested a private meeting with Christopher. They entered his office with humble postures and earnest expressions. "Mr. Reynolds," Amanda began, her voice trembling, "we owe you an apology, not just for how we treated you that day, but for the attitudes and biases we've carried for so long. The therapy opened our eyes to things we didn't want to see about ourselves. We were wrong, so wrong, and we're deeply sorry." Patrick nodded, his usual confidence replaced with heartfelt humility. "I thought I understood people, but I didn't. I judged you without knowing anything about you, and worse, I justified it to myself. Thank you for not giving up on us, even when you had every reason to." Christopher studied them for a long moment, his face unreadable. Then, with a small smile, he said, "Acknowledging your mistakes is the first step, but the real work begins now. Change isn't about words, it's about actions. Show me, and more importantly, show yourselves that you've truly learned from this." Amanda and Patrick nodded, their resolve evident. Several months later, Christopher hosted a small gathering at the bank to celebrate their progress. The event was simple: a few employees, light refreshments, and an opportunity to reflect on the journey they had all undertaken. During the gathering, Amanda and Patrick stood before their colleagues and shared their experiences. They spoke candidly about their past mistakes and the lessons they had learned. "I used to think I was unbiased, but I've realized that being unaware of my biases doesn't mean they don't exist," Amanda said. "I've learned that real change requires constant self-reflection and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths." Patrick followed, saying, "It's humbling to admit that I was part of the problem, but it's also empowering to know I can be part of the solution. This experience has taught me the importance of listening, really listening, and treating everyone with the dignity they deserve." The room fell silent for a moment before applause broke out. The sincerity of Amanda and Patrick's words resonated with everyone present. Christopher watched from the sidelines, a quiet smile on his face. He knew their journey was far from over, but this moment was a testament to the power of accountability, education, and the capacity for growth. By the end of the evening, the atmosphere was one of renewed purpose. The bank had not only become a better place for its employees, but also a symbol of what could be achieved when people chose understanding over judgment and action over apathy. Their vulnerability inspired others in the room to reflect on their own biases and behaviors, sparking a candid and meaningful conversation about diversity and inclusion. Christopher watched with pride as his employees engaged in the discussion, their words filled with empathy and a genuine desire to create a more inclusive workplace. It was a far cry from the hostility he had faced on his first visit to the bank. Toward the end of the evening, Amanda and Patrick approached Christopher. "We wanted to thank you," Amanda said, her eyes shining with sincerity. "Not just for giving us a second chance, but for teaching us what leadership really means. You didn't just tell us to change, you showed us how." Patrick nodded, his voice filled with gratitude. "You believed in us when we didn't deserve it. That's a lesson I'll carry with me for the rest of my life." Christopher smiled, his heart full. "The best way you can thank me is by continuing to grow and by helping others do the same. Change doesn't stop here." The events at the bank became a turning point, not just for Amanda and Patrick, but for the entire institution. Christopher implemented new diversity and inclusion training programs, ensuring that all employees, from entry-level staff to top executives, understood the importance of empathy and respect. Amanda and Patrick became champions of these initiatives, using their own experiences as a powerful example of how change is possible. They mentored new employees, shared their stories at company events, and worked tirelessly to create a workplace where everyone felt valued. For Christopher, the journey had been about more than just addressing a single incident of discrimination. It had been about planting seeds of change, about showing that even the most deeply ingrained biases could be overcome with humility, education, and a willingness to grow. And in the end, the greatest reward was seeing those seeds bear fruit. A team united by respect, a workplace transformed by understanding, and a legacy of leadership that would endure for years to come.